and welcome back to another edition of Metcalf's Movie Journal. This is the show where I do quick reviews for the movies that I watch, give them a score out of 10, and then add them to my list. So let's see what movie we're reviewing today. On April 28th, I watched Equilibrium, which came out in 2002. And for some reason, this was sold as the more intellectual, better written version of The Matrix. But there was nothing about it that ever triggered that comparison for me. The closest it ever got was in the fight scenes and shootouts, where it was clear this film was inspired by, and almost just trying to straight up copy The Matrix. But even though this came out 2 years later, it still looks noticeably worse. It doesn't help either that The Matrix at least had the world as a simulation excuse for the superhuman fighting abilities. But here, the only real explanation is that Christian Bale's character John Preston is simply the best of the super cop clerics in this dystopian future. So we should just accept this crazy level of badassery. That's another big difference between the two movies. The Matrix basically takes place in the modern day, with everything happening in the background. But here the bad guys controlling the world are doing it all out in the open, so it's never more complex than the Hunger Games or Divergent series, where one lone hero needs to topple an obviously oppressive regime. The story that I would most closely compare it to is 1984. There isn't a great movie version of that novel to my knowledge, so for now if anyone tells me they want a good version of that story, Equilibrium will probably be the one I tell them to watch. Both stories are set in the near future, and heavily center around the idea of complete subservience to an evil, all-powerful government. But the big separating factor making Equilibrium into a fairly unique story all its own is the idea that the world has finally found a way to end all war and bring about peace, but the cost is human emotion itself. This is done through the movie's title drug, Equilibrium, that makes everyone into borderline Vulcans. The obvious message in this movie is that getting rid of emotion in exchange for logic is itself an evil idea, since clearly our ability to love and hate is what makes us all human. On paper, and especially for a movie story, I get the need to sell it this way, but it's a bugger for me, because this is honestly something that I wish humanity could slowly start moving towards. It's definitely true that all wars and crimes can be tied back to emotions on some level. Even if that level is greed more than hate, or fear more than anger, it's still an emotional response. So the idea that less, or at least more control over those emotions, might need to start being a thing if we're going to avoid causing our own extinction, is definitely one that I agree with. So it irks me a bit to see it sold as such a cliche villain's plan. It bothers me even more since a completely logic-based society would see the inherent flaw to being loyal to a government that enforces unreasonable laws, especially when the leader so clearly doesn't abide by the rules himself. The most blatant example of this is the amount of emotion constantly being shown by the voice for the evil government figurehead, Father Dupont, when in such a society, that voice should have rung out like a computer speak and spell, as opposed to the Banana Republic Far Cry-style bad guy voice that we got. Plot holes like this can be found throughout, and the poor quality special effects means this never had a chance of measuring up against the likes of The Matrix. But it's still an alright action movie, and probably the best film version of 1984 I've seen, so if you don't know that story, it's definitely worth a look. I'd be more inclined to call it a newer, better Demolition Man, instead of comparing it to The Matrix though, to help keep expectations where they should be. I ended up giving it a 6 out of 10, and it landed at number 574 on my list, putting it right here, in between Titanic and Fantasia 2000. And as always, thanks for watching. Thanks for watching another edition of Metcalf's Movie Journal. Be sure to click like and subscribe for new videos every week. And if you have a movie that you really want me to watch, be sure to drop me a comment.